Chapter 1. Across the water. The boat left the coast of England under a sky already bruised purple, the kind that promised trouble and meant to keep it. It was a narrow vessel, all dark wood and creaking ribs, smelling of tar, salt, and old prayers soaked into the planks. By the time they reached open water, the Irish Sea had risen against them. Waves slammed the hull with deliberate force, as if the sea were testing it. Each impact rattled teeth and bones alike. The mast groaned, ropes snapping tight as whips, while the wind tore at cloaks and breath, stealing words straight from the mouth. Spray lashed across the deck, cold enough to sting, leaving salt on lips and fear in the chest. The boat pitched hard, up then down, so violently the boy thought it might fold in half. Below deck, cargo slid and crashed, and somewhere wood cracked in protest. Water forced its way through seams no one had noticed before, pulling at their boots despite frantic bailing. Night fell fast, too fast. The moon vanished behind racing clouds, and darkness swallowed the horizon. The sea became a moving black wall, endless and alive, each wave taller than the last. Shane, a young boy, clutched the rail until his hands burned, stomach heaving as the world tilted and spun. Beside him, a seaman stared into the storm, face grim. "This crossing is never gentle," he said. "The sea knows who does not belong." A wave broke over the bow, knocking the boy to his knees and ripping a shout from his throat. For a breathless moment the boat hung sideways, the sea roaring close enough to touch, close enough to claim them. Then the hull slammed back down. Hours passed like that, measured in survival rather than time, until at last the wind shifted. The waves softened reluctantly, like a beast easing its teeth from bone. Ahead, faint and green as a half-remembered dream, the coast of Ireland rose from the dark. The boat limped toward it, scarred, leaking, but afloat, while behind them the sea continued to rage, furious at what it had failed to take. Shane was 11 years old and built like a boy who had learned to take up as little space as possible. He had dark hair that never stayed neat, no matter how often his mother tried to tame it, and eyes the color of wet stone, watchful, quiet, older than they should have been. People often mistook his silence for good behavior, but it was really the habit of someone who had learned that listening hurt less than asking questions. Since his father died, Shane moved as though the world might bruise him if he stepped too hard. His father's death had not been sudden in the way storms are sudden. It came slowly, lingering in the house like a damp chill that never quite left. There were weeks of whispered conversations behind closed doors, the smell of medicines, the way his mother's smile grew thinner each day. When it finally happened, there was no drama, just a terrible stillness, and a chair left empty at the table that no one ever sat in again. Afterward, everything became smaller. The house felt too large for only two people, yet somehow more cramped than before. Money thinned. Friends spoke kindly, but briefly, as though grief were catching. Shane's mother did her best. She always did, but the weight of loss bent her shoulders and stole her sleep. Some nights Shane lay awake listening to her cry softly in the next room, pressing his face into the pillow so she wouldn't hear him breathing. It was Shane's grandmother who wrote first. They lived across the water in a place older than memory, where fields still followed the curves of ancient stone walls and stories clung to the land like mist. They offered what they could, a roof that didn't echo, warm meals, help with the boy, a chance to begin again where grief might be shared instead of endured alone. Shane understood more than his mother realized. He knew they weren't leaving because they wanted to, but because staying had become unbearable. England held too many reminders, streets his father had walked, a doorway he would never open again, a life that had quietly collapsed inward. On the morning they left, Shane stood on the deck of the boat beside his mother, coat buttoned crookedly, fingers clenched around the rail. He did not cry. He watched the land pull away, grey and distant, and wondered if parts of himself were being left behind with it. He did not yet know that this quiet, observant boy, this child shaped by loss, was exactly the kind of human the old magic of Ireland would notice, and exactly the kind it would choose. The ship lurched one final time before settling against the quay, wood scraping stone with a tired, wounded sound. Shane felt it through his boots before he heard it, a shudder that ran up his legs and into his chest, as if the ground itself were unsure whether it wished to hold him. "Careful now," someone shouted. Ropes thudded. A bell rang. The air burst suddenly alive with noise. Ireland struck him all at once. The smell came first, Sharp salt and rotting seaweed, smoke from peat fires drifting in from somewhere unseen, damp wool, fish laid out too long in open crates. It was heavier than the air he knew, thick enough to taste. Each breath felt unfamiliar, as though his lungs had to learn this land anew. Then the sounds, too many, too close. Dock workers calling to one another in voices rough and musical, words blurring into accents Shane struggled to follow. Horses stamped and snorted. Gulls screamed overhead, bold and scavenging, swooping so near he ducked instinctively. Somewhere a woman laughed, somewhere else a child cried, and beneath it all the constant slap and suck of water against stone. Shane stepped forward, and the world tilted. The dock seemed to move under his feet, swaying as if the sea had followed him ashore. His stomach lurched, his head swimming. For a terrible moment he thought he might fall, vanish into this crowd of strangers and smells and shouting voices. His hand shot out and found his mother's coat. He clung to her desperately, fingers twisting into the worn fabric as though she were the only solid thing left in the world. She smelled like soap and travel and tiredness, and Shane pressed close, his face level with her side, overwhelmed by how foreign everything felt. People surged past them, men in coarse coats, women with shawls pulled tight against the wind, faces weathered and watchful. Some glanced at them with open curiosity, others with no interest at all. Shane felt too small among them, too quiet, as though he had stepped into a story already halfway told. The light was different here, greyer, softer, filtered through mist that clung low over the harbour. Buildings leaned close together, stone darkened by age and rain, their edges unfamiliar and severe. Nothing looked the way it should have. Shane's mother rested a hand on his head, steadying him as the ground finally stopped swaying. "It's all right," she said, though her voice trembled just enough to tell him she wasn't entirely sure it was. He nodded but did not loosen his grip. This land was not England. It did not feel like anywhere he had ever been. It smelled older, sounded louder, watched more closely. And as Shane stood there on the dock, clutching the one person he trusted in a world turned strange, he had the unsettling sense that Ireland had already noticed him too. They stopped outside a low inn at the edge of the town, where the road thinned and carts gathered like tired beasts. Horses stood steaming in the cool air, heads low, leather creaking as they shifted their weight. Men with weathered faces moved among them, lifting crates and sacks with practiced ease. Shane's mother spoke quietly with one of them, a carter bound inland, while Shane waited at her side, the noise and movement pressing in around him. When the man nodded, their trunks were hauled down from the ship's cart and tied fast behind his wagon, rope biting deep into the wood. "I can only go as far as wheels will take us," the man said, gesturing with his chin. "Your people's place is beyond the lanes." The cart carried them out of the town, past the last huddled houses and the crooked church tower sinking into mist. Shane sat close to his mother as the road narrowed, the wheels groaning as they crossed ruts filled with rainwater. Fields spread out on either side, dark, heavy soil bordered by low stone walls, sheep lifting their heads to watch them pass. After a long while the carter slowed and reined in the horse. "No farther," he said simply. The trunks were lowered carefully onto the ground, and Shane felt a sudden fear twist in his chest as the man untied the ropes and climbed back onto his seat. But before the cart turned away, another figure stepped out from the hedge-lined lane, a broad-shouldered man in a worn coat, his hair streaked with grey. Her father, Shane's grandfather. There was no great rush of words. He embraced his daughter tightly, then crouched to Shane's level, studying him with grave, kind eyes. Without comment, he lifted one of the trunks as if it weighed nothing, then another, settling them across his shoulders. "The rest is a short walk," he said. "The land doesn't welcome strangers who come too easily." Shane didn't know what that meant. They followed him on foot then, along a narrow lane sunk deep between hedges, and across open fields where the grass bent under their boots. Shane watched his grandfather's back, solid, familiar in a way he hadn't yet earned, and felt something loosen inside his chest. The farm lay ahead, unseen but real at last, waiting beyond the rise of the land. And for the first time since leaving England, Shane sensed they were no longer alone. The farmhouse came into view slowly, as though it had been waiting to be noticed. It sat low against the land, stone walls darkened by age and weather, its thatched roof bowed but sturdy, like an old woman who had learned how to endure. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady line, and Shane found himself watching it, comforted by the simple fact that someone had kept a fire alive. Before they reached the door, it opened. His grandmother stood there, small but solid, wrapped in a dark shawl that smelled faintly of smoke and wool. Her hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back neatly, and her face was lined in a way that spoke not of hardship alone, but of long habit, of laughter, worry, prayer, and work, all etched together, her eyes fixed on Shane at once. "Well then," she said softly, and her voice carried the warmth of the house behind her, "you've come a long way, my treasure." She took him in without hesitation, pulling him against her skirts, her arms strong and sure. Shane froze for a heartbeat, then melted. She smelled of bread and turf smoke and something comforting he had no name for. Her hand rested on the back of his head, firm and protective, as though she were anchoring him to the earth itself. "God rest your father," she murmured, not as a question, but as a fact acknowledged. Then she kissed Shane's hair and stepped back. "You're safe here now." Inside, the farmhouse wrapped around him. The air was warm, thick with the smell of peat burning low in the hearth. The walls glowed softly in the firelight, stone hung with bits of dried herbs and tools polished smooth by years of use. A heavy wooden table stood at the centre of the room, scarred and sturdy, with benches pulled close. Everything bore marks of hands, real hands, living hands that had shaped and used it. His grandmother moved at once, as though the house were an extension of her body. She took his coat, hung it by the fire, pressed a mug of warm milk into his hands without asking. Shane's fingers trembled as he wrapped them around it, the heat sinking deep into his bones. "Sit," she said, nodding him toward a stool. "You'll eat in a moment." Outside, the wind worried at the walls, but it sounded distant here, kept firmly at bay. The fire crackled, the kettle sang softly. Shane felt the tightness in his chest ease, just a little more, as if the house itself were breathing with him. This place did not feel strange. It felt old, older than England, older than his memories, but not unkind. It felt like a place that knew sorrow and made room for it, the way it made room for cold and darkness and still endured. As Shane sat by the hearth, his grandmother's hand resting briefly on his shoulder as she passed, he understood something without words. Whatever waited for him in this land, magic or danger or change, this house would hold him. This was home now. And for the first time since his father's death, Shane believed he might be able to sleep. They gathered around the table as dusk settled fully outside, the light fading from the small windows until the fire and a single candle took over the work of seeing. The table was crowded but welcoming, bowls set close together, elbows nearly touching, as though space was something shared rather than owned. Shane sat between his mother and his grandmother, his feet not quite reaching the floor. A thick slice of brown bread was placed in front of him, still warm, its crust rough against his fingers. There was stew, dark and rich, heavy with potatoes, onions, and meat that had cooked long enough to forget its toughness. Steam rose as the bowls were set down, carrying the scent of herbs and earth and time. "Eat," his grandmother said simply. "You'll have crossed half the world on an empty stomach." Shane obeyed. The first mouthful nearly undid him. It tasted nothing like the food they had eaten since his father fell ill, nothing thin or careful about it. This was solid food, meant to keep a body upright and moving. He ate slowly but steadily, aware of his grandparents watching him with quiet attention, as though nourishment was something that required witness. His grandfather spoke little at first, chewing thoughtfully, his hands resting on the table between bites. When he did speak, his voice was low and even, the voice of someone used to being listened to without asking for it. "The crossing was rough?" he asked. His mother nodded. "Rough enough." "Aye," his grandmother said, snorting softly. "It always is. The sea doesn't care for changes." They ate a little more before the conversation returned, circling cautiously, like people testing the ground after a fall. "There's room," his grandfather said at last, looking at his daughter rather than at Shane. "More than enough. The boy can have the small room by the hearth until spring. It keeps the heat best." His mother's shoulders eased, just a fraction. "Thank you." "You needn't thank us," her mother replied. "You're home." There was a pause then, one weighted with the absence of a man who should have been there. Shane focused on his bread, listening without seeming to. "You can rest," his grandmother continued, softer now. "No rush to decisions. The land will still be here in the morning." "And the neighbours?" his mother asked quietly. "They'll come when they're ready," his grandfather said. "And when they do, They'll bring more questions than sense. We'll manage. A faint smile passed between the old couple, shared and unspoken. Shane sensed whole histories in that look, arguments weathered, losses endured, joys carried quietly. His grandmother reached across the table and laid her hand over her daughter's. "You've done right," she said. "Grief travels poorly alone." The fire cracked, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind moved through the fields, but inside there was only the sound of eating, breathing, living. Shane finished his stew and sat back, full and heavy-limbed, the day finally catching up to him. As the adults spoke on in low, practical tones, of chores and seasons and what could wait until morning, Shane let their voices wash over him. He did not understand everything they said, but he understood this. The table held court, the house listened, and for tonight that was enough. When the meal was finished and the dishes cleared, Shane's grandfather rose from the table and nodded toward the far end of the house. "Come along, lad," he said gently. "I'll show you where you'll be sleeping." Shane followed him down a narrow passage, the floor cool beneath his stockinged feet. The firelight thinned as they went, but it never quite disappeared. His grandfather moved carefully in the low space, ducking his head, one broad hand trailing along the wall as though greeting an old friend. The room was small but warm, tucked close to the hearth on the other side of the wall. A narrow bed stood against the stone, covered with thick woolen blankets folded neat and heavy. A small wooden chest sat at the foot of the bed, its lid already open, and a single candle burned on a stool, its flame steady and kind. "There," his grandfather said, "best place in the house on a cold night." He lifted Shane's trunk with ease and set it down beside the bed. The effort barely seemed to touch him, this man of wide shoulders and work-hardened hands, but he moved slowly all the same, careful not to startle the boy. "Let's see what you brought with you," he said. They knelt together, the grandfather lowering himself with a soft grunt. He opened the trunk wider and began to set things out: folded shirts, worn trousers, a scarf Shane's mother had knitted. Each item was placed with care, as though it mattered where it landed. "You've travelled far," the old man said quietly. "That takes more strength than folk realize." Shane watched his hands, scarred, steady, gentle as they smoothed the blankets. Something loosened in his chest once more. "I don't feel strong," Shane said at last. His grandfather paused, then sat back on his heels, giving Shane his full attention. "No," he said, "I wouldn't expect you to." The words surprised Shane. He swallowed. "I feel wrong, like I don't belong anywhere. England doesn't feel like home anymore. But this place—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Feels too big," his grandfather supplied, "and too old." Shane nodded, relief flooding his face. The old man leaned against the wall, arms resting on his knees. "When I was your age," he said, "I thought a man had to be loud to be brave. Took me years to learn otherwise." He reached out and adjusted the blanket at the foot of the bed. "Belonging isn't something you arrive at all at once. It grows, same as roots, slow, and mostly out of sight." Shane stared at the floor, his voice barely above a whisper. "I miss my doll all the time." His grandfather's hand settled on his shoulder, heavy, warm, certain. "Aye," he said, "that never stops. But it does change. One day you'll carry him without it breaking your back." Shane's eyes burned. He pressed his lips together, fighting tears, then failed. They came quietly, his shoulders shaking, his head bowed. His grandfather did not rush him or speak again. He simply stayed, solid as the walls, until the storm passed. When Shane finally looked up, exhausted, the old man smiled. Not a wide smile, but a real one. "You can talk to me," he said, "any time, even when you don't have the words." He stood, towering again, and blew out the candle until only the fire's glow remained. "Sleep now, morning will come soon enough." As his grandfather closed the door softly behind him, Shane lay back beneath the heavy blankets, the house warm around him, the night no longer quite so frightening, and for the first time in a long while he felt held, even in his grief. Sleep came quietly, not all at once, not like a door slammed shut, but like a tide easing in, slow, patient, irresistible. Shane lay beneath the heavy blankets, the warmth of the hearth seeping through the stone wall at his back. The house made its small, living sounds around him, the soft tick of cooling embers, the distant murmur of adult voices fading into night, the wind brushing past the eaves without anger. For the first time since his father's death, his body did not brace itself against waking. His hands loosened, his jaw unclenched. The tight knot he carried behind his ribs, always there even when he slept, unwound thread by thread. Breathing deepened, lengthened, until it matched the slow, steady rhythm of the house itself, and then he was gone. At first, he dreamed of walking. He moved through long grass wet with dew, his feet bare but unhurt. The sky above him was neither day nor night, but something in between, washed pale with mist. He felt no fear, only curiosity, as though he were exactly where he was meant to be. The land hummed softly, not with sound, but with presence. Then his father was there, not as he had been at the end. Thin, quiet, fading, but whole, strong, laughing softly, the way he used to when he thought no one was listening. He stood a little distance away as if giving Shane space to choose. Shane ran to him. His father knelt and caught him, arms solid and warm, smelling of earth and wool and home. Shane buried his face against his chest, and for a moment the ache lifted completely. There were no words, none needed, just the comfort of being held, of knowing he had not been forgotten. When his father rose, he did not pull away. He only rested his hand on Shane's shoulder and pointed. Beyond them, the mist thinned, and Shane glimpsed things he did not yet understand. Hedgerows bending where no wind touched them, lights flickering low to the ground like fallen stars, paths crossing and recrossing themselves in impossible ways. Something small laughed, not unkindly. His father's voice came gently, like a memory being placed carefully back where it belonged. "You'll be all right," he said. "Listen well." The dream shifted. Shane found himself lying once more, but not in the bed, on warm earth instead, the ground breathing beneath him. Roots curled deep below, vast and ancient, holding everything together. He felt them the way one feels a heartbeat through another's chest. Safe, anchored, seen. When morning light finally touched the edge of his sleep, Shane did not wake with a start. He surfaced slowly, reluctantly, as though climbing from deep water. His cheeks were damp, but his chest felt lighter than it had in months. He had slept, truly slept. And though the dream faded, its warmth lingered along with the faint unsettling sense that something in this land had watched over him as he dreamed and had decided quietly to let him rest.